Thanks, Bill. Thanks, everyone, for coming over and keeping up with us in this time. My name is Boris. I'm part of partner engineering team, which is essentially please look at us as your Google partners to success. And I want to forward the mic to Guy, who is one of our top partners, to describe the awesome system they designed using various APIs to support enormously increasing number of devices.
Right. So Boris is very humble, but we did build this thing on the shoulders of giants, in this specific case Google, but I'll also talk about some other publicly available data that we use. Just a little bit about us. We're a fairly large studio with over 1,200 people across 8 different offices around the world. It's not just boasting PR here. It's when you have so many studios and they mostly work independently, the same kind of questions usually pop up. One studio already solved that problem and then another studio is tackling it again, which is basically why I joined Plarium 2.5 years ago. My title is Platform Technology Specialist, but essentially what it means is that I'm serving as some kind of interface between the internal studios and the platform holders. And what I try to do at Plarium is drive innovation through adoption of new technology. So think of me as an internal evangelist of new tech. If, for example, Google comes up with Google Play integration into Chrome OS devices, that's something that I would try to push internally, look for the right studio in the right time in their pipeline to kind of integrate that kind of that tool. I'm also doing research, so I'll let the R&D guys deal with the development. I'm part of the research team, but while the rest of the research team is actually doing market research, which means they're playing games, I'm doing technology research. And my background is actually in the EDA or electronic design automation industry. I used to work at Cadence Design System. I think they're headquartered somewhere over there, but I'm a bit disoriented now. And when I joined Plarium, the first kind of question I had to tackle is the fact that there are over 15,000 devices registered when you go to Google Play dashboard. You'll see that number. Other resources track even higher number of devices, but it's in the thousands or tens of thousands. So developers approached me and they told me, hey, our biggest problem is that we don't know which devices we should target if you want to optimize the process, and which devices should we test on. So that was basically my first research project at the company, and it's an ongoing research because that market changes all the time. And you need the right tools, right? You want to navigate an ocean. You're not going to take that old crumbling ship. Technically, that's not an ocean. That's the Mediterranean. But I still didn't have time to take any pictures here in San Francisco and the Bay Area of an actual ocean. So that's all I had. There are many ways to measure that this kind of data. You can use internal data. If your company is already established, you have some games in the market, you can poll the devices that your players are using. But there are 2 problems there. First of all, you have to make sure you actually collect the data and the right kind of data. There is a lot of misreporting when it comes to these devices. And you have to do some manual tweaking. And it also means that you're skewed towards your current player base. So if, for example, our bread and butter is MMO strategy games, and we want to decide an action RPG game, it might not be the same user base that play these kind of games. They might actually have different device properties. So the data that we have internally might not be the best data for the job. Luckily, there is some publicly available data, or maybe I'll add, there was publicly available data. Open Signal reports, they used to share public information up until 2015. And then if anyone is familiar with Unity Analytic hardware stats, they used to have a public page for that. And I think that the last time it was updated was in March 2017. So that's around a year ago. No problem with that. There's also, I think there's also some initiative in Unity for internal, sharing this kind of data with developers. But you have to work with them, and it's not something that you can just get off the web. And then Google, they also have their Android distribution dashboards, but that information is kind of limited. But when you look at all of that, you have your internal data, you have publicly available data, you can actually kind of work the two things together. And then you realize that, hey, the top 10 devices represent just 15% of the market. Again, this is from the Open Signal report, so this data is like 3 years old, but while the devices change, the fact that the top 10 devices in Android don't represent a large portion of the market is still, it's an ongoing issue. It's something that still exists today. I think that the number is even smaller right now. And ideally, you want to reach better coverage than 15% of the market. So you have to take a different approach, and this is what I did. Again, I used to work in the EDA industry. I had a lot of relations with hardware manufacturers, mostly in the mobile space. So when you look at all of these devices, there is actually some things that are common to all of them. All of them have the same resolution, 4 gigs of RAM, and even more importantly, all of them are running the same Snapdragon 820 chipset. And the Adreno 530 GPU. Well, Samsung is special in that regard because they're Galaxy S devices. You can have 2 different devices running completely different SoCs underneath, either their own Exynos or the Snapdragon. I think there are some other manufacturers with that kind of division, but Samsung is definitely the largest one. And all of these devices are running, or at least used to run Android 6 when they released. And that basically means that maybe we don't have to test for each of these individual devices. We can just take one of them as a representative. So this is basically the SoC, or system on a chip approach. Android devices, they're dominantly ARM architecture based, 98% of the market. And eventually, you have only a handful of hardware manufacturers, so Qualcomm, Samsung, MediaTek, Huawei, and some others that are developing these SoCs that are basically in each and every Android phone. So there's still loads of combinatorics that are going on. So 2 SoCs, one SoC might be used on phones that have different RAM and OS configurations. But that is still much easier to track than 15,000 separate devices. So looking at it from an SoC perspective, the different component of the system on a chip, you can actually tackle the market by separating the devices into buckets, right? So looking at the graphic GPU component, we can see right here, again, this is all data, but 80% of the market was dominated back then by 10 different GPUs. So it means that if I want to test my game on different GPUs, I don't have to test on 10 devices to get just 15% of the market. If I use the data wisely, I can test 10 different models and cover 80% of the GPU market. Again, these are 2015 numbers. It changes over time, but the fact that around 80% of the market is covered by 10 to 15 devices, that remains the same over time. So again, you can pick up different distinct devices and have a very good QA coverage, which brings us to the next question: which device should I target? I have like let's say 10 different GPUs. And what we usually try to do is go for the lowest common denominator, right? The weakest GPU is the one that we should target as our base. And then we can say, hey, if we target these 8, we cover 80% of the market, and it's likely that the other graphic cards will be stronger or more powerful than that. And this is where you can actually use benchmark websites to the rescue, GFX Bench and 3D Mark. Basically, if you look at the benchmarks there, you can see that looking at these devices, Mali 400 it was actually the most popular device back in 2015. It covered almost 1/3 of the market. It was also the weakest out of these 8. So it was easy for me to rely on this data and go back to our developers and tell them, hey, if you target the Mali 400 as your base GPU, you will easily cover 80% of the market, and you won't have to worry about other devices that are too weak for the game to run on. And so that was GPU segmentation. There's also OS market segmentation. And again, that's where Google really helps us with their own distribution dashboards. It's a public website. You can just Google it. And if you're not familiar with it already, you should be. Again, you need to run some sanity checks. Do these overall Android numbers represent your actual target market? Because you're developing games, and maybe that includes Android watch devices and stuff like that. You want to try and cross-reference that with different numbers, either your own or some other external source, to try to see if that's the ideal market that you're looking into. But then again, my game will be released next year and not today. So I'll quote a person of the year, Kane, he who controls the past commands the future. Anyone familiar with that character? Or am I the only person who played Command & Conquer? OK, there are a few. Great. It didn't go unnoticed. Great. So what we can do with that information, Google basically gives us a current snapshot. But that's why we have the Internet Wayback Machine. Just look at older historical cached snapshots of the same page. And with some spreadsheet manipulation skills, you can actually try to plot the graph. So back in 2017, March 2017, when one of our studios told me, hey, I'm going to release the game only in 2018. Should I target Android 4.4? I was able to go back to them and tell them, hey, it looks to me that by mid-2018, it will cover only 10% of the market. And lower Android releases will cover even less than that. So we're still looking at 80% of the market if you only target Android 5 and above. So that's useful information, not only if you look at it right now, but also if you try to plan for the future. Another sort of fragmentation that we have is screen size fragmentation. It's still a problem because while I did find some public sources, there were some issues with some of them. Again, devices sometimes misreport the screen size. And then you have the official numbers from the Android dashboard. But in Android dashboard, they usually give you the resolution and DPI, and not resolution, but the device sizes in different category buckets like large, extra large, and the DPI. And sometimes what you're looking into is actual resolutions. What's running? How many devices are running on 180p? How many are running above that? And there's also aspect ratios, right? Devices are getting wider or taller depending on the orientation. You want to ask yourself the question, hey, should I support 18:9 devices? Should I support ultra-wide 21:9 devices? There's no way to gather public data that tells you how many devices in the market are actually in that aspect ratio. And that's even before we're getting into display cutouts, which is a trending thing ever since the Essential phone, I think, last summer. But expect to see, based on the Barcelona conference, Barcelona Expo, you should see a lot more of those in the coming year or years. And that will make things even harder for you. So I think that one of the biggest things for us was when Google released their device catalog in the Play console. It basically lets you see all the supported Android devices, and you can click on each device and see detailed hardware info. If you're not familiar with that part of the console, you should definitely get yourself familiar with that. Because it also lets you, instead of working with the manifest file, you can actually work directly from there and exclude your game by blacklisting it on devices that you don't want to support. So for example, If you found a serious OpenGL bug that happens on Nexus 9 device, maybe you want to remove that until you actually fix the bug. So players won't download your game on the Nexus 9 and then get crashes and give you bad reviews. And what's even cooler is that you can actually filter devices based on the different specs. So that works exactly in the direction I mentioned earlier. That's like the SOC approach. And then I can raise another question. Hey, we found a serious OpenGL bug in Nexus 9. Maybe it's not just with Nexus 9. Maybe it's also with other Tegra K1-based devices. So the NVIDIA Shield tablet, for example, is running the exact same SOC. If you're blacklisting Nexus 9, you might want to consider blacklisting similar devices as well. And now you can actually get all that information in a very easy way. But that's not all, because what's even cooler is that it helps us answer different marketing questions, right? So if we have the technical question coming from one of the studios, hey, should I support devices with less than 1 GB of RAM in my game that is already released? Because I'm starting, there's a feature creep, and I'm trying to implement new stuff. And suddenly, I'm not so sure that the older devices will work with that feature set. So essentially, the marketing question they have is what % of the player base is even running the game on devices with less than 1 GB of RAM? And an even better question would be, hey, how is my game rated on players that have devices with less than 1 GB of RAM? Because maybe there is like a huge percentage of them, playing the game on these devices, but they're already having a really bad experience, and they're rating your game very, in a negative way. And essentially, what we really want to know, let's be greedy, right? What revenue percentage is coming from devices with less than 1 GB of RAM? And the device catalog gives you all these answers to all these questions, right? In case you've never seen it before, okay, these are fake numbers, right? None of our games make $3 billion a month yet. But let's say, 30 million devices with less than 1 GB of RAM represent only 13% of your user base. But at the same time, they represent 2/3 of your revenue, and they give you a very good rating. So that's definitely, I'd go back to that developer, and I tell them, no, you shouldn't drop support for 1 GB of RAM. If anything, you should drop support for everything else except that because of these numbers. So yeah, if you haven't used device catalog, either for this purpose or other purposes, that's one of the most powerful tools, I think, for us on the Google Play console. It's something that you should be familiar with and use it. But then you also have to remember 2 things. The first one is that market changes over time, right? So I talked about it earlier, but if one of the developers asks me the same question, and they're only developing a game that will be released in late 2019, these numbers will also change. If 30% of the market right now has less than 1 GB of RAM, I can expect that number to be smaller as time goes by. That's something to remember. And you also have to remember that this data is just for your game. The more games you have, the better, because you can cross-reference that. But it's skewed towards the games that your player base is playing. If you're making match 3 games, and suddenly you want to make a new battle royale game, that's slightly different market. So maybe you shouldn't be looking at the same devices as the current player base you have right now. So all of these advices were for development. If you didn't listen to that advice, because why test before release, and nobody got time for that, there's another tool, Android Vitals, that help you track potential issues in the wild, like after your game was already released. Again, it's a great tool on its own. Recently, for example, it helped us track a rise of new issues that happened in already stable games that were in maintenance mode, so no new updates. They're already out in the market. And suddenly, there was an uptick in the crash rate in one of these games. So that's like a good indication, even if nobody is actually looking at the numbers for your own internal crash analysis tool. If there's somebody, somebody to look at the vitals, then you got your base covered. But in the context of device targeting, we can use that and the device catalog together to actually close the loop. So, for example, if I see a specific crash, right, an increase in crash, I get like bad behavior report from Android vitals, I need to ask myself the question, hey, should I fix this or should I exclude devices that have this kind of bug? So again, this isn't the recommendation to test in production, but if you look at like this specific example, the Samsung Galaxy S8 suddenly showed almost a quarter of the sessions in that device crashed, okay? And older devices didn't have any problems. So that brings up the question, hey, is this problem unique to Samsung Galaxy S8? Or maybe it's because it's running a new version of Android, or maybe it's because it's a new SOC. And if I use Android vitals and device catalog together, I can actually try to narrow the question down and find what the actual problem is. And then it would be easier for me to decide if I want to fix it or if I want to exclude it. So that's basically how we already use some of the tools that Google provides us with. We'd obviously like to see more. Okay, so for anyone here from Google, this is my wish list. So we want to see more filters in the device catalog. And the same applies to Android developer dashboards. Again, the big difference is that device catalog gives you numbers based on what the game you already have. Android developer dashboards are general for like the whole ecosystem. So you should really rely on both. So for example, I want to see what kind of, what subset of the market is already capable to run 64-bit games. Right? There is if Google just announced recently that by 2019 you must be compliant with 64-bit, that's great. But maybe I don't want to manage two different versions. Maybe I want to drop 32-bit. And if 64-bit is right now just 20% of the market, or if it's 80% of the addressable market, I'll have to answer that question in a different way. Would also love to see resolution and aspect ratios and historical data, because otherwise I'll have to keep going to the Internet Wayback Machine to get like older snapshots. Then just before my talk, I didn't even mention Firebase Test Lab, which is another great tool. It was mentioned in a previous talk. But then again, what I'd love to see there is some kind of coverage-driven approach for SOCs, right? So if Google is giving us the ability to test on 150 device combinations, I want to see what I already covered. I want to see that I covered the Snapdragon 820. I wanted to see that I covered that Exynos chip. So I don't have to test on two devices that are supposedly different, but actually they have the exact same internals. Last but not least, store listing experiments. That's another part of the device catalog. It's something that is actually being used more by our business performance team. But again, if you could integrate device catalog capabilities into that, so we'd be able to test A/B test on two different device segments. So one with a large amount of RAM, another with smaller amount of RAM. See if it works any differently. That might give us new insight that we don't have right now. OK, while I'm here, I would also love to see language and locale support for A/B testing there. It's not technical, but it's something that the people at my company told me that I should be mentioning. But that's basically it from my side. So thank you very much for listening.